are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies, discussing this all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?
So good morning and welcome back to Politico's Sustainable Future Summit, to everybody in the room and those of you tuning in online. I am Joanna Roberts, I'm Politico's Senior EU Policy Editor, and it's great to have so many people with us this morning. Before the break, we heard from Commissioner Hoekstra, and then a panel on the post-2030 regulatory framework and what exactly we can expect from the EU as they put that into practice. And we also heard from Nicholas Cummins, the CEO of Bentley Systems, about the challenges and opportunities facing the EU's infrastructure. But now I'm joined by Francesca Micheletti, who will be moderating our next panel, which is digging into how the Commission is using industrial tools to encourage decarbonisation. Francesca, what are you hoping to get from this discussion?
Well, we're quite excited because there is a tool that is state aid, so public subsidies to the industries, that's being used in a new way. It's developing, so it's being used to help EU countries to fund their industry and decarbonize their industry. So we're excited to hear about how that's going, what the risks and the challenges of it are.
Okay, well, I'll let you get started.
Thank you
very much.
Well, welcome to this panel. I'm Francesca Micheletti. I'm a senior competition correspondent for Politico. Joining me, I have Andreas Eisel from Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, and Anthony Whelan, from Deputy Director General at the European Commission at DG Competition. Anthony has been 1 week in the job, in this specific job, but he has been a long time with the European Commission, so he has the full perspective on how this is all evolving. So, as I mentioned before, the European Commission is making an unprecedented use of its state aid tools to try and help EU countries coordinate and get through an EU industrial policy. The CSAF, the Clean Industrial State Aid Framework, is the key tool that has been inaugurated this year by Competition Commissioner Teresa Ribera. And I'd like to ask Anthony how that's going and what the role of the CSAF is in the EU industrial policies push.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca, and good morning, everyone. It's good to get a first outing in the new job. On a topic such as this in particular, because obviously the interface of competition policy, industry policy and sustainability is one that is very important to my executive vice president and to us in DG Comp. Let's situate CSAF a little bit in the overall landscape of tools. So something we should never lose sight of when we sort of dive into the question of the interaction of competition policy and industrial policy is the important sort of systemic hygiene effect of competition policy in general, in terms of driving dynamism, of driving innovation, of driving investment, because dominant or let's say privileged firms don't invest very much. And then the question becomes, within that broader role of competition policy, including state aid policy, which has the additional role of ensuring that the single market works as well as it should, how do we adapt to changing circumstances in the industrial and innovation landscape? Where CSAF comes in is in three ways, one of which is perhaps more novel than the others. It promotes the energy transition. We've been doing that for a long time, and there it's a strong simplifying role. It promotes decarbonization of industry, again, not a new topic, but hopefully a somewhat simpler template to work. And it promotes investment in clean tech manufacturing. Now that is a somewhat more novel area for state aid to be active, not completely so. In regional aid, for example, we have long promoted manufacturing investment. And in that role, it's situated in a broader policy push by the Commission. It's no accident, for example, that some of the key scoping of technologies in the CSAF is linked to the Net Zero Industry Act adopted in the last mandate, because a number of other industrial policy tools are also needed to drive this forward. And ultimately, and this is where the limits of state aid come in, or some of the limits, it is allied to things such as the availability of national funding. It comes at a key moment when member states are trying to finalize, for example, their RRF spending, a major additional source of spending power that was available from the EU to member states. And, well, that's probably enough for a warm-up.
Thank you. And then I'll give the floor to Andreas. So, Andreas, you've been researching on these topics for a while and how the EU is trying to get together its industrial policy. What is your view on CSAF? What are the limits?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you already mentioned, CSAF is situated in a galaxy or in a sort of broader regime of state aid frameworks. You mentioned the regional aid framework, but there's the CAG, so the guidelines on environment, energy, climate protection. You have GBER, General Block Exemption Regulation. You have a lot of different frameworks that were put into place. CSAF is a bit a consequence also of temporary frameworks that were put into place during the various crises that we have recently, and trying to make this somewhat permanent. And while this has been, I think, now accompanying a broader push of IPCIs, of course, we're going to talk about them as well as one of these frameworks, and it's part of a broader push towards moving from an overall framework of the EU state aid regime of actually trying to limit state aid and trying to distinguish as much as possible between what is called good or bad state aid, so trying to have a more economic approach in trying to evaluating, now to a more open, like more strongly linked to basically industrial policy, getting more active basically, and trying also to face competition, sometimes unfair competition from abroad. So it's part of a broader thinking of also how are other big powers using basically themselves state aid. Some of the elements included is the these matching aid clauses, which also form part of this. So one has to understand this as part of a broader push, but of course there's also limits in how far only the state aid framework and trying to flexibilizing also these state aid frameworks to do industrial policy can actually go. As you mentioned, there's limits in national capacities basically, maybe be financial, but they can also be linked in terms of administrative or technical capacity, can also be very different preferences of governments, and there are also some limits in terms of, I think if we want to do EU industrial policy, it's important to identify basically the best projects across Europe, but also basically coordinate when it's national state aid to have strategically projects going the same direction, working together across Europe. And that's some of the limits that's currently there. Some of the instruments that are there are trying to move in this direction, like IPCIs, but for example, CSAF still, I think, has very much also a national-based approach, basically. And so there's the big question how we can deal with this. And so we really need to complement state aid policy, which is mainly working on the supply side, basically, how we can complement this with demand policies that's mainly at the member state level, but also what is the role of the EU budget, what is the role of also this new planned European Competitiveness Fund, how we can find synergies basically between how we set up state aid rules and the EU budget and parts of it basically, but also the role of the EIB, for example, and a variety of other instruments also in terms of trade and trade defense.
There's a lot of coordination to be done. And also it seems CSAF asks a lot of member states, because obviously it's up to them to spend the money. You tell them go and spend it, but then they need to do that. So I wonder if it's already possible to do any stock taking on CSAF. So obviously the framework is quite new. It came out in June. What are the early observations? We've heard some grumblings that there was not huge enthusiasm on member states' part. Is that right?
Oh, well, they haven't reached me yet, but on day 7, maybe that's unsurprising. I would be a bit reluctant to already start stock taking in what is perhaps just, I'm not sure it's quite 6 months since CSAF was adopted. It was adopted relatively fast, so in that sense there wasn't an awful lot of pre-adoption time for member states to already start designing schemes for that. The fact that we have had 4, if I remember well, schemes already put forward and approved for an overall amount of 12 billion is, I think, encouraging, because it also shows others this can work, it can go quite quickly if you more or less take the templates as they stand. And there's, of course, plenty in the engine room that isn't yet to be publicly announced. On the coordination point, I take what Andrea said, that CSAF is more of a national aid tool without any particular requirements on cross-border coordination, because of the balance you need to strike between relative simplicity and speed in areas where we face a climate crisis and a geopolitico-economic challenge, let us say, and the interest in things that we pursue with things like IPCIs, like multi-country participation, broad strategic coherence, spillovers, and so on. But that, as is also sometimes complained, brings an inevitable cost of working together, of moving forward in lockstep, and we are doing our things to try and accelerate that, but it is certainly not a model for every type of state aid, I would think.
Thank you. So we've been mentioning IPCIs quite a bit. Can we just spell out a little how they came about, what they are, and especially the direction that they're taking? If I understand correctly from Andreas, we're going towards a more centralized handling of them.
Yeah, so basically IPCIs are so-called important projects of common European interest, and it's basically one of the treaty articles that allows basically to deviate from the general state aid prohibition, basically, if you're running basically projects that are considered strategic, and that was later defined, started in 2014 with a communication that this has to be with cross-country collaboration. So now it needs to be at least 4 countries, as far as I'm aware, and there needs to be a number of spillover effects and basic collaboration, and as a view of basically trying to integrate the value chain together. And it's an interesting instrument. I mean, it was one of the instruments that was, we have seen a gradual, actually, return of industrial policy, and we've seen a gradual change in terms of the different state aid frameworks to try to adapt to this. And while I think we see, geoeconomic and geopolitical competition very strongly since the COVID crisis, especially, and then the Ukraine crisis and the increasing role of China, in terms of subsidizing, there have been pressures before, and it has already been felt actually since the late 2000s, and then also with the Great Recession and the Eurozone debt crisis, and there were already trends among other big powers like the US and China to move to a different sort of basically technological competition increased, and IPCIs was a way then for the Commission. There was a lot of pressure on the Commission at the time to actually flexibilize quite strongly in the early 2010s. This was the case already, and the Commission found a way basically to trying to contain this, allowing flexibilizing basically for some big projects in terms of also state aid intensity, so it can go up to 100% of the funding gap, and allowed in a way then to control also a bit where does this go, and having a more European approach, basically trying to get together different member states. The instrument, I think, has evolved quite a bit over the last 10 years. It has moved, I think, interestingly from, I think in the beginning was very strongly member state driven, just alone member state driven, and some of the big companies that were situated in these countries. And it was very an ad hoc process. Even if there was this communication set up, nobody really knew in the beginning how to actually do this exactly, because it was quite new, and it was also a question how this was being picked up. But I think there's been a lot of learning over the last years in terms of making this process basically more coherent, also trying to address some of these issues in terms of, okay, these are very big projects now, how can we simplify this maybe a bit, and how can we maybe speed it up a bit, even if they never can be extremely quickly, because they include just a lot of different member states and projects also. But I think there's been an interesting trend towards centralizing it in a way and trying to coordinate more from the top, trying to identify what are really strategic areas and priorities of Europe, and having the Commission working together, DG Comp, but also DG Grow and the other DGs, basically, and trying to think about this and then discuss together with the member states which sort of big projects we actually want to engage in, and then trying to develop these projects. So I think that's one of the most interesting instruments that is developing or has developed over the last years. The question still remains how we can ensure that there will be a sufficient, maybe also participation from smaller member states or from countries with less financial firepower. I think the new European Competitiveness Fund, the proposal for it, is trying to address this somewhat. There's a top-up plan for IPCIs, but it's still going to be an instrument where as it's so much innovation-driven, basically in terms of the projects that are typically supported, that there will probably likely be a bias also in the future towards specific countries, so specifically more advanced and more of the Western European countries also, because they have often also the stronger research level already there, and also in terms of companies that are present there.
Thank you. Yes, addressing imbalances, that's a big topic for state aid, because those who have been around the Commission for a long time know that originally state aid is prohibition. It's prohibited by default. So these are all frameworks that create exceptions and ways in which this can be done. The reason for which state aid was originally a prohibition is to prevent deep-pocketed member states from creating imbalances. So how are these addressed now with these frameworks? Like, has the Commission thought about this point?
If I may say, we think of little else, at least in my end of DG Comp. I mean, the balance is already there in obviously very high-level terms in the treaty. Yes, it says there is a prohibition of state aid, and then you have multiple letters giving the various principled exceptions, including the IPCI article, the more general one on things that promote economic development, which is a pretty large brief. And the balance between richer and poorer, or bigger and smaller member states is always integral there, because ultimately it's a competition tool that is wedded to the overall internal market architecture. The adaptations we've been doing in the most recent past, in a changed world, I think have to be approached in part by looking at the intensity of competition within Europe and the intensity of international competition and the way in which that international competition is being waged. You referred to subsidies in other countries. It is not that we have the ambition to match on all fronts and in every way what is done in countries with very different economic models, but we cannot ignore what they are doing either. So most of what we have still in the state aid acquis, I think, can be described as framing quote-unquote good aid, which is not too distortive as between member states, or as between companies, which is not too undermining of companies' own incentives to do it alone on market terms, or crowding out market investment. If I speak of R&D and I aid, for example, or environmental aid, these are to promote public goods, which are relatively far from the direct play of competitive interaction. When we go further towards the marketplace, and IPCIs bring us to what is called first industrial deployment, which is close but not in the market, let us say. Manufacturing investment aid in something like CSAF or in the CHIPS Act brings us even closer. But the closer we get to the market, the more targeted we must be. And that's why some of our state aid instruments are becoming more sectoral and more tied to overall industrial policy priorities. Now, at the end of the day, it's not our money. We create frameworks that member states can use. We encourage them, as with IPCIs, or, for example, in the framework of RRF spending, to do common projects where it makes sense. But it is ultimately not for us to tell member states, you shall spend on this, and well, not on that if it is an authorized type of aid. Where the competitiveness fund comes in is that it potentially creates a little bit more interaction between the still rather small union budget, even if we'd rather like an increase, and the national budgets, in that it would allow the union budget to top up IPCI projects that may allow some member states to participate who might otherwise not be incentivized to do so. And in the other direction, it creates the possibility of top-ups of the fund from member state budgets, but of course that will typically be in order to fund projects in their area, as national compartments in the InvestEU do already now, for example.
Thank you. Yes, the European Competitiveness Fund. So this is big news this year. It's a new fund which has some interplay, as we have said, with state aid. So Andreas, what's your take on the ECF and how it works together, it would work together with state aid, of course, bearing in mind its early days?
Yeah, of course it's under negotiation, but I mean, we've seen the first draft and the revised one very recently. I think it's a very important step in the right direction if we want to develop a more European industrial policy, which I think is warranted in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic conditions, basically. Of course, the issue is that the negotiations on the overall size of the EU budget are very complicated, and that implies then that also the size of this competitiveness fund is limited, which means that there is some money now there, more money than before, I think more strategically to be used to actually finance certain strategic priorities of the European Union. But I think given that it has, in the end, a relatively small size, I think it will be very important to exactly think about how we can create synergies between this fund and how the state aid rules are basically set up to incentivize in a way. I think that should be the approach. If projects are maybe selected at the European level, then there is some additional money there, and that could then, on the one hand, lower costs for member states, but at the same time, one could say, okay, certain projects that are already basically said to be a good project at the European level maybe don't need the same level of state aid scrutiny, for example. So I think it's really important, and I would encourage the Commission to really think about, once the negotiations are further on the competitiveness fund, but I think it's a discussion to already have now, to really think about how all of these different existing frameworks can actually work together with this new fund, and really thinking about, okay, how can we create incentives that can be financial ones, but they will be, of course, limited, but how can we also create incentives with the rules to coordinate, so that the member states coordinate their spending better and think just maybe a bit less about the specific interest of a specific company on their territory, but more about the strategic priorities of the Union, and that we set ourselves out together. And I think that's a crucial point actually in thinking this together. The advantage on the Commission side is as it's a EU competence, basically, as we have seen with CSAF, these things can be adopted quite quickly, actually, but I think it's really important to think this together from the start and see which sort of incentives can be basically set there. I think it's interesting, so there's the top-up of IPCIs was mentioned, but I think there are also some other targeted proposals inside the Competitiveness Fund which are interesting in terms, for example, of financing certain projects that are important for resilience, for example. We could think of different sectors, but let's say certain pharmaceutical products where actually it's not profitable to do this in Europe, but we could say we need some strategic reserves, basically, at least some companies that still can produce this. Doing this at the EU level then removes a bit this question of state aid, because to my knowledge, some of these projects that have been proposed by different member states have been quite difficult to find the right place inside the state aid framework, basically. And so maybe some of these issues moved to the EU level, basically, and so the EU budget can be useful, but I think it really needs to be thought together then how transforming also the various different state aid frameworks.
Thank you. So if I have to look at the architecture of the European Competitiveness Fund, like what should the Commission make sure happens to ensure a smooth interaction between the fund and the state aid frameworks?
Well, and with any EU fund, and we have a few at the moment that serve as examples, like the Innovation Fund, there is all which operate in areas where member states also want to invest, and where there are state aid possibilities for them to invest. There is always the very legitimate question: why can't the funding rules be the same? And to the greatest extent possible, we are trying to build common parameters for union funds and the parameters that we set via state aid for national spending in these areas. It will not always be possible to do a perfect fit. Why? Because of the very nature of state aid being nationally oriented, money to always national firms. So the guarantee that you have with EU selection in what is called direct management of the most meritorious projects, no matter where they come from in our 27 member states, is by definition more or less absent from an otherwise perhaps quite equivalent national scheme. So we always have to give an extra look at whether additional safeguards are involved in what are, also by definition, strategically interesting areas, to be sure that any level of intra-EU competition is not significantly distorted. So it's tough, but we manage to do it. We have under the Innovation Fund concepts known as auction as a service, and now coming grants as a service, meaning we run a competition with EU selection on merit, innovation potential, and so on. And then member states whose projects are deemed fitting, but which didn't make the cut because, frankly, we don't have enough money, are allowed to aid those in a second step. So models like that show it can be done with safeguards built in to ensure that this doesn't tip the balance too much between those member states who then participate in such an added extra opportunity administered by us and those who do not.
And this would entail some cooperation between different directorates general of the Commission. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in the case I just cited, between ourselves and DG Klima, and I would imagine, I was not there in the detail at the time, but I imagine also DG Grow, to mention but three. So right. It will depend on the sector after that, obviously.
Right. And let me turn now to impact assessment. So we were discussing before, Andreas, that it's difficult to measure the impact that the aid has on innovation or on growth. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. In the last years, we have seen this basically flexibilization in a way, some changes in the state aid rules, and we've seen also, especially with the temporary frameworks during this crisis situation, a strong growth in, on the one hand, aid notified, but also in the aid then direct dispersed basically to companies. The Commission is very good in doing ex-ante assessments and trying to define actually for different sectors and for different types of projects, different approaches in terms of administratively set amounts of how much state aid basically to a certain project can go, or these more sophisticated funding gap analysis and so forth. So before a project starts, there's a strong vetting from the Commission to actually ensure that a project needs aid, how much aid basically, and maybe also what is the best way to give this aid in a way. Where we have less knowledge, and I think is an issue that is important though for the future, is to actually look what is happening once actually state aid has been notified, so basically granted by the Commission, and then is supposed to be dispersed to the companies by the member states, basically, where we have just very little knowledge, partly, of what's happening. It's member states that are supposed to provide this information. This information is often coming very late or partial. At different sort of databases show very different data, and that makes it difficult, actually, to assess whether what we see now as stated, but as industrial policy, is actually achieving its objectives. Because in my view, and I think that's has been a general tendency, state aid rules and the frameworks have been moved also in the direction of being more strategically used than to do industrial policy. But then to know if actually this industrial policy is successful in achieving its objectives, is it actually efficient what we're funding, these projects that we're funding, is it actually leading to positive outcomes? For the moment, we know very little, and that makes me a bit worried about us waking up in 10 to 15 years that, okay, we spend actually quite a lot of additional money to do industrial policy, but maybe the return on this investment from the state is maybe not that high. And that's why I think it's crucial to really try to strengthen these efforts. And I know it's difficult for the Commission because it also depends a bit on the member states in providing this information, and they may maybe not be so keen on that. But I think it's crucial, actually, to really try to do ex-post evaluations, and I would really find it great if the Commission would have the time, or try to find the time to do this also, because I think it will help us to focus more. And the big question of the discussion of how we do industrial policy in Europe in the most recent years has been also that we might need to take we need to make some choices, some strategic choices of the technologies to support, basically, or the areas to support, where we have had a quite broad approach in the last years, but maybe we actually need to focus more. And I think really trying to do these sort of post evaluations will help us to better identify where it actually worked and which sort of instruments also were maybe the most successful, and trying to build on that and strengthen these instruments, basically, and incentivize more the use of these instruments in comparison to other ones.
Anthony, would you agree on impact assessment? Does the Commission need to do more? Can it do more?
Well, I'll play my new boy joker here. I'm not deep yet in the engine room of ex-post evaluation of schemes. I'm just two general remarks. One you hinted at, Andreas. Access to information is always an issue in state aid, both ex ante and perhaps even more so ex post. So a popular movement saying that we need more access to information by the Commission on how state aid actually works on the ground is of course always welcome. More seriously, and the Commission has, I think, a good tradition internally of ex-post evaluation generally. So I take note of what Andreas says, that he senses it is a bit wanting in regarding some of the more interesting areas of state aid development in recent years. And IPCIs in their current form have been around, give or take, 10 years, so it's certainly one that merits a little bit of investigation, I would say.
Thank you, and this brings us to the end of this panel. So, very quick closing remarks. Key expectation for CSAF in the next year?
Lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, we really need to see how well this is picked up. I mean, what I think is interesting is that you mentioned that maybe there have not been that many decisions, but there's this approach to go more to schemes. So a scheme is directly covering a lot of individual projects rather than just if you look project by project. I think, as you said, though, it's very early. So, but if you compare it with other frameworks, it's more flexible if I compare it with the CAG, for example, on many aspects. So I think the expectation anyways can be that it will be used as an instrument, as it's often also for big projects. These naturally take a bit longer. And I think some of the projects that were now put into CSAF, they were originally in the TCTF. And so the reason that these projects got basically already notified is because they had already some time before to do it. And now, once it's under CSAF, will take a bit, but my expectation is there will be a lot of projects.
Great, so we will be watching this space. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thanks.
And I am going to welcome on stage my colleague Zia Weise, who will moderate the next session.